Margaret O'Connor froze mid-step on her porch, coffee mug slipping from arthritic fingers to shatter against weathered pine boards. The massive black bear 30 yards away wasn't rummaging through garbage or foraging for berries. It was deliberately dragging something metallic and blood-stained directly toward her cabin. This wasn't natural bear behavior. The creature stopped, dropped a GPS tracking collar at the base of her birch tree, and sat back on its haunches like a trained dog awaiting commands. Mrs. Henderson's scream pierced the morning silence from the neighboring property, followed by the crash of her kitchen window slamming shut. Margaret's trembling hand found the porch railing as memories of her daughter Sarah's final phone call flooded back. Warnings about wildlife trafficking, about marked ones, and dangerous discoveries. The bear's intelligent brown eyes never left hers, and somewhere in the nearby brush a tiny whimper revealed the real reason for this unprecedented visit. Who had sent this message? And why was her life about to change forever? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. 2 weeks earlier, Margaret O'Connor had been just another 72-year-old widow counting pennies and pills in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. The morning ritual never changed: black coffee at sunrise, Harold's empty chair across the breakfast table, and the crushing silence that followed her daughter Sarah's death 5 years ago. The property tax notice taped to her refrigerator served as a daily reminder that $3,200 might as well be $32,000 on her $847 monthly Social Security check. The cabin had been in Harold's family for 80 years, weathered but solid, perched on 43 acres of pristine woodland. Every morning Margaret would sit on the wraparound porch where Sarah had taken her first steps, where Harold had proposed on a snowy Christmas Eve in 1972, where 3 generations of O'Connors had found peace among the towering oaks and mountain laurels. Now the county wanted to sell it to developers for back taxes, and her only son Jake seemed more interested in the potential profit than preserving family history. Deputy Sheriff Jake Sullivan was a good man drowning in bad circumstances. At 45, the divorce had cost him everything: the house, half his pension, and the respect of his teenage daughters who lived 3 states away with their mother. Child support payments of $1,800 monthly, combined with his ex-wife's mounting medical bills from her lupus diagnosis, had pushed him into territory no honest cop should explore. The wildlife trafficking operation had started small, looking the other way when certain hunting violations occurred, filing reports that omitted key details. The extra $2,000 monthly had seemed like a lifeline, not a noose. Margaret's relationship with Jake had grown strained over the past year. Where she saw Harold's workshop and Sarah's childhood memories, Jake saw equity and practical solutions. Their Sunday dinners had become tense negotiations, with Jake pressing her to be realistic about her situation, while Margaret clung to the belief that some things mattered more than money. She'd raised him better than this, hadn't she? Harold would have known how to reach their son, how to remind him of the values they'd instilled during those long-ago summers, when Jake helped his grandfather repair fence posts and track deer through morning mist. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that her late husband had been a conservation officer for 37 years, dedicating his life to protecting the very wildlife that now seemed central to their family's unraveling. Harold's old veterinary supplies still filled the barn: bandages, antiseptics, and emergency medications for injured animals he'd brought home over the decades. Sarah had inherited that same passion, earning her doctorate in wildlife biology before taking a position with the state that would ultimately cost her life. As Margaret sat in Harold's chair that fateful morning 2 weeks ago, watching purple martins build nests in the birdhouses he'd crafted, she had no idea that everything was about to change. The empty coffee cup in her hands would soon be forgotten, shattered on pine boards, as a message arrived that would force her to choose between the law and her conscience, between her son's financial salvation and her own moral survival. The GPS collar lay in the morning dew like an accusation, its orange vinyl strap torn and stained with what Margaret prayed wasn't blood. She approached slowly, her bare feet silent on the cool grass, while the massive bear watched from beside the old oak tree. The serial number was clearly visible, VWS 2019 SR 847, property of Virginia Wildlife Services. Margaret's nursing instincts kicked in as she examined the device. The torn edges suggested violent removal, and dark stains around the buckle told a story she didn't want to acknowledge. The bear made a low, huffing sound and padded toward the woodpile Harold had stacked 3 summers ago. Margaret followed, her heart hammering against her ribs with each deliberate step the animal took. Behind the split logs, curled in a nest of old burlap sacks, lay the smallest black bear cub she'd ever seen. No bigger than a house cat, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the morning light. The tiny creature lifted its head at her approach. Its left hind leg was wrapped in what appeared to be a child's torn t-shirt, makeshift bandaging that spoke of desperate human intervention. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," Margaret whispered, borrowing one of Harold's favorite expressions. The cub showed no fear of her presence, a red flag that sent chills down her spine. Wild animals, especially bear cubs, fled from human contact unless something had gone terribly wrong. She knelt beside the woodpile, her arthritic knees protesting, and gently examined the makeshift bandage. Underneath, a puncture wound was healing poorly, showing signs of infection that would prove fatal without proper treatment. The mother bear, for that's surely what the massive female was, sat 20 feet away, watching this examination with an intelligence that unnerved Margaret. When she looked up, the bear's dark eyes seemed to communicate something profound: trust, desperation, and a plea that transcended species. Margaret had seen that same look in the ICU when family members brought their loved ones to her, hoping against hope that someone with knowledge and compassion could save what they couldn't. As she lifted the cub carefully, supporting its tiny body with both hands, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. A small tattoo marked the cub's left ear, RC23, in neat black numerals. In 47 years of nursing and a lifetime around Harold's conservation work, she'd never seen a wild animal with identification markings like this. Research colonies use such numbering systems, but black bear cubs shouldn't be research subjects. They should be wild and free in their mother's care. The cub's acceptance of human handling confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't a wild animal. This was a creature that had known captivity, handling, and human interference from birth. The mother bear's behavior suddenly made terrible sense. She wasn't attacking or threatening. She was delivering her baby to someone she hoped could help. But how had a wild bear learned to trust humans? And why had she chosen Margaret's cabin? Inside the house, Margaret spread towels on her kitchen table and began cleaning the cub's wound with supplies from Harold's veterinary kit. The little bear lay still, occasionally whimpering but never struggling, as she flushed the puncture with antiseptic solution. The infection was serious but treatable. Harold had dealt with similar wounds in raccoons and opossums over the years. As she worked, memories flooded back of Sarah's final phone call 5 years ago. "Mom, I found something that could shut down the whole operation," Sarah had whispered into the phone, her voice tight with fear and excitement. "They're not just poaching, they're farming them. Breeding programs, Mom. Taking cubs from mothers and selling them to private collectors and research facilities. If anything happens to me, look for the marked ones." Margaret's hand stilled on the cub's bandage. Marked ones, like RC23, like this tiny, trusting creature who should be wild, but instead bore the numerical brand of human ownership. Sarah's hiking accident had never made sense. She was an expert outdoors woman who knew those trails better than her own backyard. The state investigation had been perfunctory, the case closed within weeks, the dangerous wildlife trafficking story buried with her daughter. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted her thoughts. Through the kitchen window she watched Jake's patrol car pull into her driveway, and her heart sank. She quickly covered the cub with a clean towel and moved to meet her son on the porch, leaving the mother bear visible in the yard. Jake climbed out of his cruiser, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon when he spotted the massive animal. "Mom, get inside right now," Jake commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in law enforcement. "That bear is dangerous. I'm calling wildlife control immediately." "She's not dangerous, Jake," Margaret replied quietly, her arms crossed over her chest. "She's asking for help." Jake's radio crackled with static as he reached for it, but something in his mother's tone made him pause. The bear hadn't moved, hadn't shown any aggressive behavior despite the presence of an armed officer. Instead, she sat like a patient supplicant, waiting for judgment from the humans who held her cub's fate in their hands. Jake holstered his weapon but kept his radio in hand, studying the scene with growing unease. "Mom, you can't just assume wild animals are friendly. That bear could turn aggressive without warning." His training told him to call for backup and wildlife removal. But something about the situation felt orchestrated, almost staged. The bear's calm demeanor, his mother's confident stance, and the GPS collar lying conspicuously in the yard created a puzzle that didn't fit standard protocols. Margaret led him to the kitchen where the cub lay sleeping under Harold's old fishing towel. Jake's expression shifted from concern to confusion as he examined the tiny animal. "Where did this come from? And what's that marking on its ear?" He leaned closer, his law enforcement instincts kicking in as he noted the professional-looking tattoo. RC-23. "That's not natural, Mom. Someone put that there." "Your father used to say animals don't lie," Margaret replied, gently stroking the cub's head. "They can't. This little one has been in captivity, Jake. Look how he accepts human touch, how he doesn't try to escape. Wild cubs fight like fury when handled." She pulled out her laptop, fingers moving slowly across the keyboard as she searched for information about the GPS collar's serial number. VWS 2019 SR847 belonged to a bear designated Sierra 7, officially reported dead 3 months ago from natural causes. Jake's face darkened as he read over her shoulder. The official report stated that Sierra 7 had been found deceased near Shenandoah National Park. Cause of death listed as heart failure following territorial disputes with other bears. But the GPS tracking data told a different story. Erratic movement patterns in the days before death, locations that made no sense for a wild bear, and a final signal from a private research facility 40 miles outside their jurisdiction. "This doesn't add up," Jake muttered, though his voice carried an odd tension Margaret couldn't identify. Wildlife Services would have investigated any irregularities. They're thorough about tracking data. He scrolled through the report with familiarity that surprised his mother. Since when did a county deputy have such detailed knowledge of state wildlife procedures? Margaret's suspicion crystallized when Jake casually mentioned the cub's tattoo identification system. RC probably stands for Research Colony. These facilities use numerical coding for inventory management. The words slipped out before he could stop them, revealing knowledge no ordinary deputy should possess. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she studied her son's face, noting the flush creeping up his neck and the way he avoided her direct gaze. "Jake Sullivan, how do you know about Research Colony coding?" Margaret's voice carried the authority of 47 years in nursing, the tone that had coaxed confessions from countless patients trying to hide their symptoms. "And don't you dare lie to your mother. I've changed your diapers and nursed you through pneumonia. I know when you're hiding something." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Through the kitchen window, they could see the mother bear still waiting patiently in the yard, as if she understood that human decisions were being made that would determine her cub's fate. Jake's radio crackled with routine traffic, a fender bender on Route 29, a domestic disturbance in town, but he ignored it, his attention focused on the impossible choice between his mother's trust and his own survival. "There are things you don't understand, Mom," Jake finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The department has working relationships with various wildlife management organizations. Sometimes we provide security consultation for research facilities. It's perfectly legal." But even as he spoke the words, they sounded hollow, rehearsed, like testimony he'd practiced in front of a mirror. Margaret retrieved a cardboard box from Harold's old papers in the den, her movements deliberate and purposeful. Inside, Sarah's personal effects from her office told a different story than the official accident report. Research notes, photographs of bears with identification markings, and correspondence with federal wildlife investigators painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached far beyond simple poaching. Sarah had been building a case against an organized trafficking ring that used legitimate research facilities as cover for illegal breeding and sales operations. "Your sister was investigating wildlife trafficking when she died," Margaret said quietly, spreading Sarah's documents across the kitchen table. "Look at these photos, Jake. Bears with ear tattoos just like this little one. GPS collars being removed by people in lab coats, not wildlife officers. Sarah thought she could trust the system to protect these animals, and it got her killed." Jake's hands trembled as he examined his sister's research. Photos showed bears in concrete enclosures, cubs separated from mothers at impossibly young ages, and documents detailing sales to private collectors for thousands of dollars per animal. The research facility mentioned in Sierra 7's final GPS signal appeared repeatedly in Sarah's notes, connected to a network of corrupt officials who provided legal cover for illegal operations. "She called me the night before the accident," Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Said she had enough evidence to bring down the whole operation, but she was scared. Someone had been following her, threatening her if she didn't drop the investigation. The next morning they found her at the bottom of Miller's Gorge with a broken neck." The weight of revelation settled over Jake like a suffocating blanket. His sister's death hadn't been an accident. It had been murder, orchestrated by the same people who now paid him to look the other way when certain shipments moved through the county. The $2,000 monthly payments that kept his daughters fed and housed came from blood money, from an organization that killed wildlife conservationists and trafficked endangered animals for profit. Outside, the mother bear stood and began walking toward the woods, her job complete. She had delivered her message and her most precious possession to the one human she somehow trusted to understand. The GPS collar lay in the grass like evidence in a crime scene, waiting for someone brave enough to follow its implications to their logical conclusion. Jake stared at the sleeping cub, this tiny witness to crimes he'd helped enable through willful blindness and desperate rationalization. His choice was no longer between financial security and ethical compliance. It was between becoming his sister's avenger or remaining her unknowing betrayer. The next morning brought Dr. Elena Rodriguez to Margaret's door, her veterinary bag in hand and an expression of professional concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. Jake had arranged the visit, claiming his mother needed expert advice about the injured cub, but something about the timing felt orchestrated. Elena examined the little bear with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle but her questions pointed. "Where exactly did you find him? Has anyone else seen the cub? Have you contacted wildlife services yet?" Margaret watched carefully as Elena worked, noting how the veterinarian's examination focused less on the cub's medical needs and more on his identification markings. When Elena photographed the RC-23 tattoo with her phone, claiming it was for medical records, Margaret's nursing instincts screamed warnings. "That's an unusual marking for a wild animal," Elena commented casually. Research facilities sometimes use similar coding systems for their breeding programs. Breeding programs? Margaret kept her voice neutral, though her heart rate spiked. I thought research facilities worked with already captive animals, not wild populations. She busied herself making coffee, using the familiar ritual to mask her growing suspicion. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jake pacing on the porch, his radio active with more traffic than usual for a Tuesday morning. Elena's professional mask slipped for just a moment. Sometimes the line between wild and captive isn't as clear as people think. Conservation efforts require difficult choices, Mrs. O'Connor. This cub might be better served in a controlled environment where his medical needs can be properly addressed. She completed her examination and packed her equipment with deliberate care. I'll need to report this find to the appropriate authorities. Standard protocol for wildlife encounters. After Elena left, Margaret discovered that the cub had somehow opened the child-proof cap on her heart medication bottle. The tiny bear sat beside the scattered pills with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, but the feat itself was impossible for a wild animal. Margaret's hands shook as she gathered the medications, remembering Harold's stories about bears learning to manipulate simple mechanisms in research settings. This wasn't natural behavior. It was learned, trained, programmed through months of human interaction. The cub's intelligence became more apparent throughout the day. When Margaret dropped her reading glasses behind the couch, the little bear retrieved them from an area she couldn't reach. When her phone fell from the kitchen counter, he carried it to her in his mouth without damaging the device. Most unsettling of all, when she showed him Sarah's photograph from the mantelpiece, the cub touched the glass with his paw and made a soft whimpering sound as if recognizing someone from his past. Jake returned that evening with official paperwork and a grim expression. Wildlife Services wants to transfer the cub to a rehabilitation facility tomorrow, he announced, avoiding his mother's eyes. It's for his own good, Mom. Wild animals need specialized care that you can't provide here. But the documents told a different story than his words. The facility listed wasn't a rehabilitation center. It was the same research institution mentioned repeatedly in Sarah's notes. Henderson Hills Research Institute, Margaret read aloud. That's the place Sarah was investigating, isn't it? She studied her son's face, noting the way his jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists. The same facility where Sierra 7's GPS signal went dead. The same place mentioned in her notes about illegal breeding operations. Jake's composure cracked. You don't understand the bigger picture, Mom. These animals are already lost. The wild populations are declining, habitats are disappearing, and poaching is out of control. At least in research facilities, they serve a purpose. They contribute to conservation science and wildlife management programs. His words sounded rehearsed, like talking points from a training manual. Whose talking points are those, Jake? Margaret's voice carried 40 years of maternal authority. Because they sure don't sound like anything Harold ever taught you, or that Sarah would have believed. She pulled out more of Sarah's research files, spreading photographs across the kitchen table. Look at these pictures. Really look at them. Bears in concrete cages barely large enough to turn around. Cubs separated from mothers at 2 weeks old. Sales receipts for research specimens going to private collectors and exotic pet dealers. The photographs were damning. Bears with ear tattoos identical to the cub's marking, GPS collars being forcibly attached to sedated animals, and facility records showing dozens of research subjects that had died from stress, malnutrition, and inadequate veterinary care. One photograph showed a mother bear frantically pacing a concrete enclosure while her cubs were carried away in transport crates marked with the Henderson Hills logo. Jake stared at the evidence his sister had died trying to expose. They told me it was legitimate research, he whispered, his voice breaking. Conservation breeding programs to supplement wild populations, species preservation in the face of habitat loss. But even as he spoke, the justifications sounded hollow against the visual evidence of systematic abuse and trafficking. Margaret found Sarah's encrypted laptop hidden in the bottom of her research box, password protected but still containing fragments of her investigation. The partial files revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond simple wildlife trafficking. Judges, law enforcement officials, state wildlife managers, and research facility administrators had created a shadow system that legitimized animal abuse through fraudulent paperwork and manufactured scientific justification. Your sister discovered that Henderson Hills was selling cubs to private collectors for up to $50,000 each, Margaret said, scrolling through Sarah's notes. Exotic pet dealers, private hunting preserves, roadside zoos that needed fresh stock. They used research permits as cover for what was essentially wildlife laundering on an industrial scale. The scope of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of animals moved through the facility each year, with mortality rates that would have triggered federal investigations if the paperwork hadn't been systematically falsified. The cub seemed to sense the tension in the room. He climbed onto Margaret's lap and pressed his small body against her chest, his rapid heartbeat matching her own. In that moment of contact, she understood what the mother bear had been trying to communicate. This wasn't just about one orphaned cub. It was about exposing a system that had killed Sarah and continued to destroy countless innocent lives for profit. Jake's radio crackled with an incoming call from Elena Rodriguez. "Deputy Sullivan, we need to move the transfer schedule up. Pickup is now set for 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. The facility is concerned about the animal's condition and wants to begin treatment immediately." The veterinarian's voice carried an urgency that had nothing to do with medical care and everything to do with evidence containment. "They're moving fast because they know we're getting close to the truth," Margaret realized. Elena photographed the cub's identification markings, probably ran them against facility records. They know this little one can connect them to Sierra 7's death and the whole trafficking network. She looked at her son with a mixture of love and desperation. "Jake, you have to choose. You can keep taking their money and help them cover up Sarah's murder, or you can honor your sister's memory and help me stop this." The kitchen fell silent, except for the cub's gentle breathing and the distant sound of wind through Harold's old oak trees. Outside, darkness had fallen over the Blue Ridge Mountains, but inside the cabin, a different kind of illumination was taking place. Jake stared at his hands. These hands that had taken blood money, that had signed falsified reports, that had enabled the very criminals who had murdered his sister. "If I help you," Jake said finally, "I lose everything. My job, my pension, probably my freedom when the federal investigators start digging into my involvement." He looked at the sleeping cub in his mother's arms. "But if I don't help you, I lose my soul." And Sarah died for nothing. Margaret reached across the table and took her son's hand. "Your father used to say that doing the right thing was never the easy thing, but it was always the only thing." She squeezed his fingers, feeling the tremor of a man standing at the crossroads of his life. "We've lost too much already, Jake. Harold, Sarah, and nearly lost each other. But we can still save this little one. We can still make Sarah's work mean something." Through the kitchen window, they could see headlights moving slowly along the county road, not the usual late-night traffic pattern for their remote area. Someone was conducting surveillance, preparing for tomorrow's transfer operation. The mother bear's desperate gambit had set events in motion that none of them could stop, only choose which side of the battle they would join. Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the rumble of multiple vehicles approaching Margaret's cabin. Through her bedroom window, she watched 3 official-looking SUVs and a wildlife transport trailer navigate the winding gravel drive. The lead vehicle bore the Virginia Wildlife Services logo. But the men emerging from the convoy moved with military precision that suggested training far beyond standard animal control protocols. Jake stood on the porch in his deputy uniform, his body language rigid with the tension of a man about to betray everything he'd ever believed in. Dr. Elena Rodriguez climbed from the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, clipboard in hand and an expression of professional authority that barely concealed her underlying anxiety. Behind her came two men in tactical gear who introduced themselves as wildlife enforcement officers, though their equipment and demeanor suggested backgrounds in private security rather than conservation work. Margaret clutched the cub closer to her chest, feeling his tiny body trembling as unfamiliar voices and heavy footsteps invaded their sanctuary. "Mrs. O'Connor, we appreciate your cooperation in caring for this animal," Elena announced, her voice carrying the rehearsed cadence of someone following a script. "However, federal regulations require immediate transfer to a certified facility for proper quarantine and medical evaluation. Henderson Hills Research Institute has graciously agreed to provide emergency care at no cost to the state." She extended her hands expectantly, as if Margaret would simply surrender the cub without question. Margaret's years of nursing had taught her to read people's true intentions beneath their professional facades. Elena's hands shook slightly as she reached for the cub, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air. The wildlife officers positioned themselves strategically around the porch, their movements suggesting preparation for resistance rather than routine animal transfer. Most telling of all, Jake refused to meet his mother's eyes, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the tree line. "I'd like to see the transfer authorization and facility licensing documentation," Margaret said calmly, making no move to surrender the cub. "As a retired nurse, I'm familiar with proper protocols for medical transfers, and I want to ensure this little one receives appropriate care." Her request was reasonable, but it triggered immediate tension among the officers. Elena's clipboard contained forms, but when Margaret examined them closely, the signatures appeared rushed, and the facility certification numbers didn't match federal database formats. The lead officer, a man with scarred hands and eyes that never stopped scanning for threats, stepped forward with barely concealed impatience. "Ma'am, we don't have time for bureaucratic delays. This animal requires immediate medical intervention that only a research facility can provide. Your cooperation is appreciated, but it's not optional." His hand rested casually on his sidearm, a gesture designed to intimidate rather than reassure. Margaret recognized the tactic from her ICU days when family members tried to bully their way past visiting restrictions. "Young man, I've been handling difficult situations since before you were born," she replied with steel in her voice. "This cub is under my care until I'm satisfied that his transfer serves his best interests, not someone else's agenda." She turned to Jake, her eyes boring into his soul. "Son, your badge means you swore an oath to protect and serve. Who are you protecting today?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Jake had compromised over the past year. The officers exchanged glances, their body language shifting from professional courtesy to barely restrained aggression. Elena's facade cracked completely as she whispered urgently into her phone, reporting the unexpected resistance to superiors who clearly expected a routine pickup. Margaret could hear fragments of the conversation: civilian interference and containment protocols and authorization for enhanced persuasion. Jake's radio crackled with an incoming call from dispatch, but instead of routine traffic, the voice belonged to Judge Patricia Williams herself. "Deputy Sullivan, you're needed immediately for a family emergency. Your mother is experiencing a cardiac episode and requires medical assistance. Please ensure all civilians evacuate the property for emergency vehicle access." The manufactured crisis was designed to separate Margaret from her support system, leaving her alone and vulnerable to whatever enhanced persuasion the officers had been authorized to employ. The cub in Margaret's arms began making distressed sounds, sensing the escalating tension around him. His tiny claws gripped her cardigan as if understanding that these strangers represented danger, not salvation. Margaret's maternal instincts, honed through decades of protecting vulnerable patients, crystallized into absolute determination. "I'm not having a cardiac episode," she announced loudly enough for Jake's radio to pick up her voice. "And I'm not surrendering this cub to people who can't provide proper documentation." Elena's composure shattered completely. "Mrs. O'Connor, you're interfering with a federal wildlife investigation. This animal is evidence in an ongoing case, and your refusal to cooperate constitutes obstruction of justice." But her legal threats rang hollow, unsupported by proper warrants or judicial orders. The hastily assembled operation was falling apart under the scrutiny of a 72-year-old woman who refused to be intimidated. The lead officer's patience evaporated entirely. "Ma'am, step aside or we'll be forced to remove you from the situation." He moved toward Margaret with clear intent to physically separate her from the cub, but found his path blocked by Jake's solid frame. For the first time that morning, Jake met his mother's eyes directly, and she saw her son, Harold's son, Sarah's brother, finally choosing the right side of an impossible situation. "Officers, I'm going to need to see your federal authorization for this operation," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in law enforcement. Interstate wildlife trafficking falls under federal jurisdiction, and local law enforcement requires proper documentation before assisting with evidence seizure. His hand moved to his own sidearm, not in threat, but in clear preparation for whatever response his challenge might provoke. The tactical situation shifted dramatically as Margaret's neighbors began arriving, drawn by the unusual activity and the sound of raised voices. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the property line with her husband and their adult son, all three carrying the kind of rifles common in rural Virginia households. Word had spread through the tight-knit mountain community that something was wrong at the O'Connor place, and neighbors who'd known Harold and Sarah for decades weren't about to stand by while strangers threatened Margaret. Elena's phone conversation became increasingly frantic as she reported the deteriorating situation to her superiors. Margaret could hear fragments of the response. "Abort if complications arise," and "exposure risk unacceptable," and "fall back to secondary protocols." The carefully planned operation was unraveling in the face of unexpected community resistance and Jake's last-minute decision to honor his oath instead of his bank account. The cub seemed to sense the changing dynamics. He lifted his head from Margaret's chest and looked directly at Elena, letting out a soft, whimpering sound that carried surprising emotional weight. In that moment, Margaret understood what the mother bear had truly accomplished by bringing her baby here. This wasn't just about saving one orphaned cub. It was about forcing good people to choose between convenience and conscience, between profit and protection of the innocent. Jake's radio crackled again, but this time the voice belonged to Tommy Chen, Sarah's former colleague from the State Wildlife Office. "All units, be advised that federal agents are en route to investigate unauthorized wildlife trafficking operations in your jurisdiction. Local law enforcement is requested to secure any potential evidence and detain suspicious personnel for federal interview." The cavalry was coming, but Margaret realized that Sarah's encrypted files had finally reached the right people. Elena and her team recognized the shift in circumstances immediately. The lead officer stepped back from his confrontational posture, speaking quickly into his own communication device while scanning the growing number of armed neighbors surrounding the property. "Control, we have a situation here. Requesting immediate extraction under Protocol 7. Within minutes, the official convoy was retreating down the mountain road, leaving behind only tire tracks and the lingering scent of fear. Margaret sank into Harold's old rocking chair on the porch, still holding the cub close to her heart. Jake knelt beside her, his face streaked with tears of relief and shame. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for what I became, for what I almost let happen." The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical burden, but for the first time in months he could breathe freely again. The little bear looked up at both of them with those impossibly intelligent eyes, as if understanding that he was safe now, that the message his mother had died to deliver had finally been received by people willing to act on it. 3 days later, the full weight of Margaret's victory collapsed into devastating defeat. Federal agents arrived not as Sarah's avengers, but as cleanup specialists for a conspiracy that reached far deeper than anyone had imagined. Special Agent Victoria Cross presented impeccable credentials and a federal court order signed by Judge Patricia Williams herself, demanding immediate surrender of evidence crucial to national security interests. The paperwork was flawless, the legal authority unquestionable, and Margaret's heart broke as she realized that even the federal system had been compromised. "Mrs. O'Connor, we understand your attachment to this animal," Agent Cross said with professional sympathy that felt rehearsed. "However, this cub is a key witness in a classified investigation involving international wildlife trafficking networks. His testimony, through behavioral analysis and medical examination, could prevent hundreds of similar tragedies." The language was careful, designed to make resistance seem selfish and unpatriotic. But Margaret's nursing instincts recognized the manipulation tactics of someone accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. Jake stood helplessly as federal agents loaded the cub into a specialized transport container. His cooperation with the investigation had earned him immunity from prosecution, but watching his mother's spirit crumble as they took away the little creature she'd grown to love felt worse than any jail sentence. "They promised he'd be safe," Jake whispered, knowing the words were hollow comfort. "They said he'd be used to train other agents to recognize trafficking operations." The transport vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, carrying with it Margaret's last connection to Sarah's memory and Harold's legacy of protecting innocent creatures. She sat in Harold's rocking chair for hours afterward, staring at the empty woodpile where she'd first found the cub, feeling as though pieces of her soul had been systematically stripped away by people who spoke of justice while practicing cruelty. That evening brought news that shattered what remained of Margaret's faith in the system. Dr. Elena Rodriguez appeared at her door, no longer playing the role of concerned veterinarian, but revealing herself as a federal informant who'd been monitoring the trafficking investigation for months. "I tried to warn them about Sarah," Elena said, her voice heavy with guilt. "I told them she was getting too close, that she needed to be reassigned or transferred. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Elena had been Sarah's friend, her trusted colleague, the person who'd encouraged her daughter's investigation into wildlife trafficking. "You knew they were going to kill her," Margaret whispered, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "You knew, and you let it happen anyway." Elena's tears provided no comfort, no absolution for the betrayal that had cost Sarah her life, and now condemned an innocent cub to whatever fate awaited him in the system's dark machinery. Jake's own investigation into the federal operation revealed the scope of his mother's defeat. Henderson Hills Research Institute wasn't just a front for wildlife trafficking. It was part of a classified program that used exotic animals for experimental research deemed too controversial for public oversight. The facility operated under federal protection, its activities shielded by national security classifications that prevented media scrutiny or congressional investigation. Margaret's health began declining rapidly after the cub's seizure. Her heart condition, manageable for years with medication and careful living, worsened under the stress of loss and betrayal. Jake found her collapsed in the kitchen 2 days later, Harold's old veterinary supplies scattered around her as she'd tried desperately to prepare for the cub's return that would never come. The paramedics who responded treated her with gentle professionalism, but their eyes held the pity reserved for elderly patients whose minds had finally surrendered to grief. In the hospital, Margaret's room filled with flowers and cards from neighbors who'd witnessed her brave stand against the federal agents. Mrs. Henderson brought homemade soup and stayed for hours, holding Margaret's hand while she stared out the window toward the mountains where the mother bear had first appeared with her desperate message. "That little one knew you were good people," Mrs. Henderson whispered. His mama chose right, even if the government chose wrong. The local newspaper ran a story about Margaret's confrontation with federal agents, but the article was carefully sanitized to avoid mentioning specific agencies or operations. Rural Virginia readers learned about an elderly woman who'd tried to help an orphaned bear cub, but the deeper story of corruption and murder remained buried under layers of national security classifications and legal threats against journalists who dug too deeply. Jake spent sleepless nights researching Henderson Hills Research Institute, using his law enforcement databases to trace the facility's funding and oversight. What he discovered made him physically ill. The institute received millions in federal contracts for behavioral modification research and stress response studies that were clearly euphemisms for systematic torture. Animals were subjected to psychological trauma protocols designed to break their natural instincts and create docile, controllable subjects for further experimentation. Margaret's final night in the hospital, she dreamed of Harold and Sarah standing together in a meadow filled with black bears and their cubs, all free and unafraid. When she woke, Jake was sleeping in the bedside chair, his face streaked with tears, even in sleep. She understood then that her son's guilt would destroy him if she didn't find a way to forgive both of them for their failures to protect the innocent. "We tried, didn't we?" Margaret whispered when Jake stirred awake. "We tried to do right by that little one, even when the whole system was rigged against us." Jake nodded, unable to speak through his grief and shame. Outside the hospital window, dawn was breaking over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in shades of hope that neither of them could feel. The discharge papers came that morning, along with a prescription for medications Margaret couldn't afford and instructions for lifestyle changes that seemed pointless in the face of her loss. As Jake drove her home to the empty cabin, they passed the woodpile where the cub had once hidden, now just a stack of logs that held no magic or meaning. The mother bear's gift had been received and treasured briefly, but the forces of corruption and greed had proven too powerful for one elderly woman and her conflicted son to overcome. That night, Margaret sat alone in Harold's chair, listening to the silence where a tiny bear's contented breathing should have been, wondering if some battles were meant to be lost before they could be won. 2 weeks after the cub's seizure, Tommy Chen arrived at Margaret's cabin with a laptop computer and a grim expression that reminded her painfully of Sarah's final visit years earlier. "Mrs. O'Connor, I need to show you something that changes everything," he said, settling at her kitchen table where so many revelations had already shattered her world. Sarah's encrypted files weren't just about wildlife trafficking. She discovered something that goes to the heart of who really runs these operations. The laptop screen revealed bank records that traced the funding for Henderson Hills Research Institute through a labyrinth of shell companies and federal contracts. At the center of the financial web sat a name that made Margaret's blood run cold. Patricia Williams, not just as a corrupt judge but as the primary investor and board chairman of the entire trafficking network. "Your childhood friend has been using her judicial position to legitimize a multi-million-dollar operation," Tommy explained. "Every warrant, every court order, every legal authorization has been designed to protect her investment." Margaret stared at the financial documents with growing horror. Patricia Williams, the girl who'd been her maid of honor, who'd held Sarah as a baby, who'd comforted Margaret after Harold's funeral, had orchestrated her daughter's murder to protect a criminal empire built on animal suffering. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Decades of friendship had been nothing more than cover for a woman who viewed everything and everyone as potential profit sources. Jake's voice cracked as he read the intercepted communications Tommy had obtained through federal channels. Judge Williams ordered the hit on Sarah when she got too close to the financial connections. They made it look like an accident, but the GPS data from Sarah's phone shows she was forced off the trail at Miller's Gorge. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah hadn't died because of her wildlife research, but because she'd followed the money trail that led directly to one of Virginia's most respected jurists. The revelation about Patricia Williams triggered a cascade of other discoveries that painted an even darker picture. Elena Rodriguez hadn't been a federal informant trying to protect the investigation. She'd been Williams's inside source in the state wildlife office, feeding information about Sarah's progress directly to the people who'd planned her murder. Elena knew exactly when Sarah would be hiking alone, Tommy continued. She provided the schedule, the route information, even details about Sarah's emergency protocols. Margaret's hands shook as she processed the magnitude of the conspiracy. The federal agents who'd seized the cub weren't legitimate law enforcement. They were private contractors hired by Williams to eliminate evidence that could expose the trafficking network. Agent Victoria Cross's impeccable credentials were fabricated, her authority manufactured through Williams's judicial connections. The entire federal response had been an elaborate theater designed to remove the one witness who could connect Sierra 7's death to the broader criminal operation. The real federal investigation started 3 days ago, Tommy explained, pulling up additional files on his laptop. When I finally got Sarah's encrypted data to legitimate FBI agents, they realized they'd been investigating a shadow network of corruption that reaches into multiple federal agencies. Judge Williams has been using her position to influence witness protection programs, evidence handling procedures, and even congressional oversight committees. The scope of Williams' influence was staggering. Bank records showed payments to dozens of officials across multiple states, creating a network of corruption that had operated undetected for over a decade. Wildlife trafficking was just one revenue stream in an empire that included drug distribution, human trafficking, and money laundering operations protected by judicial immunity and federal law enforcement credentials that Williams had helped her associates obtain. Jake's radio crackled with an emergency dispatch that sent chills through everyone in the room. All units, be advised that Judge Patricia Williams has been found dead in her chambers, apparent suicide. Crime scene investigators are requesting county support for evidence preservation. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too neat, and Margaret understood immediately that Williams had chosen to silence herself permanently rather than face exposure of her criminal empire. Tommy's phone buzzed with an urgent message from his FBI contacts. "They raided Henderson Hills an hour ago," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "The facility was empty, Mrs. O'Connor, completely cleaned out. All the animals, all the research equipment, all the personnel gone. They left behind nothing but concrete cages and industrial cleaning equipment. The trafficking network had anticipated exposure and activated emergency protocols that dissolved their operations without leaving evidence behind." The disappearance of Henderson Hills represented more than just a successful escape. It meant that the cub and dozens of other animals had vanished into an underground network that could relocate anywhere in the world. Margaret's hope that federal intervention might rescue the little bear died as Tommy described the facility's systematic sanitization. Whoever had orchestrated the evacuation possessed resources and planning capabilities that suggested international criminal organization rather than simple wildlife trafficking. Margaret's phone rang, displaying Elena Rodriguez's number. Against Jake's advice, she answered, hearing the veterinarian's voice shaking with fear and desperation. "Mrs. O'Connor, they're killing everyone who knows too much. Judge Williams didn't commit suicide. I watched them inject her with something that made it look like a heart attack. They know I talked to the FBI, and they're coming for me next." The line went dead before Margaret could respond, leaving behind only the terrible certainty that Elena's betrayal of Sarah had ultimately signed her own death warrant. Jake's investigation into William's death revealed the methodical elimination of the entire conspiracy network. 3 wildlife officers died in apparent accidents within 24 hours of the federal raid. 2 research facility administrators suffered fatal heart attacks despite no previous cardiac history. A federal contractor involved in the false authority operation was found dead in his hotel room from an apparent drug overdose, though toxicology reports would later reveal exotic compounds not available through normal channels. The systematic killing spree represented more than just evidence destruction. It was a message to anyone who might consider exposing similar operations in the future. Margaret realized that her survival depended not on her knowledge of the trafficking network, but on her apparent irrelevance to the larger organization. She was just an elderly woman who'd briefly interfered with one small operation, not a threat significant enough to warrant elimination. Tommy's final revelation shattered any remaining hope for justice. "The federal investigation is being classified under national security protocols," he explained quietly. "Everything we've discovered about Judge Williams, Henderson Hills, and the trafficking network will be sealed indefinitely. The official story will be that Williams was a lone actor who took her own life when faced with minor ethics violations. The cover-up was already in motion, designed to protect institutional credibility rather than pursue justice for Sarah's murder." Margaret sat in stunned silence as the full scope of her defeat became clear. Not only had the system failed to protect Sarah or the cub, but it was actively working to erase any evidence that crimes had been committed. The mother bear's desperate message had triggered a chain of events that exposed massive corruption. But that exposure would be buried under classifications and cover stories that protected the powerful at the expense of truth. "There's one more thing," Tommy said reluctantly. "The FBI found evidence that this wasn't the first time Judge Williams ordered a murder to protect her operations. Sarah was just the latest victim in a pattern that goes back over 15 years. The revelation that other families had suffered similar losses provided no comfort, only a deeper understanding of the evil that had been operating under the cover of respected institutions." As Tommy packed up his laptop and prepared to leave, Margaret understood that this would be their final meeting. He was being transferred to another state, his involvement in the investigation deemed too dangerous for his continued safety. "I'm sorry we couldn't save him," Tommy said, referring to the cub whose fate remained unknown. "Sarah would have been proud of what you tried to do." Alone in her cabin that night, Margaret stared at the empty woodpile and wondered if the mother bear had somehow known that her sacrifice would expose evil even if it couldn't prevent it. The truth about Sarah's murder had finally been revealed, but justice remained as elusive as the little cub who disappeared into an underground network that seemed to possess unlimited resources and protection. The silence of the mountains felt different now, heavy with the weight of secrets that would never be officially acknowledged, corrupted by the knowledge that some battles against evil could only be fought in darkness, with no guarantee of victory and no witnesses to remember the fallen. 6 months after the federal raid that had found nothing but empty cages, Margaret O'Connor sat on her porch watching the morning mist rise from the Blue Ridge Mountains when she heard a familiar sound that made her heart stop. The soft huffing of a bear, deliberate and purposeful, came from the direction of Harold's old woodpile. She rose slowly from her rocking chair, her heart medication forgotten on the side table as a small black shape emerged from behind the stacked logs. The cub, now nearly full-grown but still recognizable by his intelligent eyes and the faint scar on his left hind leg, stepped into the clearing with the same cautious confidence his mother had shown months earlier. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she realized that somehow, impossibly, the little bear had found his way home. His coat was thick and healthy, his movement strong and sure, but most remarkably, he showed no fear of human presence, despite whatever horrors he'd endured in captivity. "Well, I'll be," Margaret whispered, borrowing Harold's favorite expression as she moved slowly down the porch steps. The bear, she still thought of him as her cub despite his size, approached with the same trust he'd shown as an injured baby. When she knelt and extended her hand, he gently touched her fingers with his nose, a greeting that seemed to acknowledge their shared journey through darkness toward this moment of impossible reunion. Jake's patrol car appeared on the mountain road as if summoned by some cosmic timing. Margaret watched her son's face transform from routine patrol alertness to wonder and disbelief as he recognized the bear standing peacefully beside his mother. "Mom, how is this possible?" Jake asked, stepping slowly from his vehicle with the careful movements of someone afraid to disturb a miracle. The bear turned toward Jake with what Margaret could only describe as recognition and forgiveness. Despite everything Jake had done and failed to do, the intelligent creature seemed to understand that redemption was possible for those willing to accept it. When Jake knelt beside his mother, the bear allowed both humans to touch him, creating a moment of connection that transcended species and circumstances. Mrs. Henderson's appearance at the property line brought the first of many neighbors who would witness the bear's return throughout the day. Word spread through the mountain community with the speed of wildfire. The O'Connor bear had come home. By evening, Margaret's yard was filled with people who'd heard the story and needed to see for themselves that sometimes, against all odds and institutional power, love could triumph over systemic corruption. The bear's behavior throughout the day revealed the depth of intelligence that had made him so valuable to his captors. He demonstrated problem-solving abilities that suggested extensive training, but more importantly, he showed emotional awareness that seemed almost human in its sophistication. When Margaret experienced a minor dizzy spell, the bear immediately moved to support her, guiding her to a chair with the same protective instincts his mother had shown. Tommy Chen arrived that evening with news that explained the bear's miraculous return. "The entire Henderson Hills network collapsed 3 weeks ago," he reported, his voice carrying excitement and vindication. "International authorities raided facilities in 4 countries simultaneously. Your little friend was being held in a compound in West Virginia when federal agents finally found the real operation." The scope of the takedown was massive. Over 200 animals rescued, dozens of traffickers arrested, and millions in assets seized. The investigation that had begun with Sarah's encrypted files had eventually reached Interpol and triggered a multinational operation against wildlife trafficking networks. Judge Williams' death actually helped the case, Tommy explained. Her suicide note contained detailed confessions and location information for facilities across 3 continents. Apparently, she'd kept records as insurance against her partners, never expecting to use them as a final act of conscience. Margaret learned that the bear's intelligence had made him a star witness in the federal case. His trained behaviors and responses to specific commands provided crucial evidence about the systematic abuse methods used in trafficking operations. "He testified in his own way," Tommy said with a smile. His reactions to photographs and voices helped federal agents identify dozens of traffickers who thought they were safely anonymous. The bear's return sparked a media firestorm that Margaret had neither expected nor wanted. Television crews arrived from major networks drawn by the human interest story of an elderly woman reunited with the bear cub she'd tried to save. The narrative that emerged in national coverage focused on heartwarming reunion themes while carefully avoiding the darker details of corruption and murder that had made the story possible. Jake's role in the original conspiracy became public knowledge during the media coverage, but his cooperation with federal investigators and his mother's vocal support helped frame his story as one of redemption rather than simple corruption. "My son made mistakes," Margaret told reporters, "but he chose to do right when it mattered most." That's what Harold would have wanted, and what Sarah would have forgiven. The federal government's response to the media attention surprised everyone involved. Instead of attempting to reclaim the bear as evidence or enforce wildlife regulations, authorities granted Margaret a special permit to serve as his permanent caretaker. The decision was presented as recognition for her role in exposing the trafficking network, but Margaret understood it was really an attempt to control the narrative by keeping the most sympathetic elements of the story in public view. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, Elena's replacement in the State Wildlife Office, arrived to conduct the official evaluation required for Margaret's permit. The contrast between the two veterinarians was stark. Where Elena had been calculating and manipulative, Sarah was genuinely committed to animal welfare and conservation. "This bear has been through trauma that would destroy most animals," she observed. "His trust in you represents a kind of healing that no research facility could provide." The permit came with conditions that transformed Margaret's property into an unofficial wildlife education center. School groups began visiting to learn about bear behavior and conservation, while Margaret shared carefully edited versions of her story that emphasized the importance of protecting innocent creatures from exploitation. The bear, now officially named Lincoln after the president Harold had most admired, became an ambassador for wildlife protection. Lincoln's presence attracted other wildlife to the property in ways that seemed almost magical. Bears that had never approached human habitation began appearing at the forest edge, not threatening but observant, as if acknowledging Lincoln's special status. Margaret began to understand that his mother's original message had been about more than saving one cub. It had been about creating a bridge between human and animal worlds that could heal the damage caused by greed and corruption. Jake's relationship with his own children improved dramatically after Lincoln's return. His daughters, now young teenagers, began visiting their grandmother regularly, drawn by the opportunity to interact with a bear who defied every expectation about wild animal behavior. Margaret watched her son teaching his girls about respect for nature and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. The financial pressures that had driven Jake toward corruption evaporated as media attention brought unexpected opportunities. A publisher offered Margaret a substantial advance for her memoir about the experience, while documentary filmmakers provided additional income for sharing her story. The property taxes that had once threatened to force her from Harold's family cabin became manageable through book sales and speaking fees from conservation organizations. Lincoln's daily routine became a source of wonder for everyone who witnessed it. He would wake Margaret each morning by gently pawing at her bedroom window, then accompany her on walks through the mountain trails where she'd once feared to venture alone. His presence provided security and companionship that no human relationship could match, a living reminder that love could survive the worst circumstances and emerge stronger. On quiet evenings, Margaret would sit in Harold's rocking chair while Lincoln rested nearby, and she could almost feel Sarah's presence in the mountain wind. Her daughter's work had finally achieved its intended purpose, not through official channels or institutional justice, but through the simple power of one mother's desperate love translated across species and circumstances. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now filled with laughter and purpose. Visitors came from across the country to meet Lincoln and hear Margaret's story, carrying the message of hope and redemption back to their own communities. What had begun as a trafficking conspiracy had become a conservation success story, proving that sometimes the most powerful victories emerge from the deepest defeats. As autumn painted the Blue Ridge Mountains in brilliant colors, Margaret understood that Harold and Sarah lived on through the work she and Lincoln continued together. The Mother Bear's sacrifice had not been in vain. It had created a legacy of protection and love that would inspire others long after Margaret herself was gone. In the gathering twilight, surrounded by the peace of the mountains and the steady breathing of a bear who had chosen trust over fear, Margaret O'Connor finally felt that justice, while delayed, had ultimately prevailed. Sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as the deepest losses. Margaret O'Connor thought she'd lost everything: her husband Harold, her daughter Sarah, and finally the little bear cub who'd brought meaning back to her empty days. At 72, watching federal agents drive away with that innocent creature felt like the final defeat in a life suddenly too full of goodbyes. But here's what Margaret discovered, and what every one of us over 50 needs to remember. Love doesn't end when hope seems lost. It transforms, it persists, and sometimes it comes home in ways that defy every expectation. When Lincoln returned to Margaret's porch 6 months later, healthy, strong, and still trusting despite everything he'd endured, she understood that the bonds we forge through sacrifice and compassion are stronger than any system designed to break them. Her empty nest became a sanctuary. Her lonely cabin transformed into a place where 3 generations could gather, where grandchildren could learn that protecting the innocent never goes out of style, and where an elderly woman's refusal to give up created ripples of hope that reached far beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains. Have you ever had someone or something return to your life when you least expected it? What moment of unexpected joy reminded you that love truly does conquer all? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how hope found its way back to you.